Autism is a large and complex topic, perhaps especially for girls and women. This episode of the Creative Mind audio podcast includes an excerpt from a Uniquely Human podcast episode with informative perspectives from Zhara, an autistic woman and advocate. Therapist Julie Bieland has multiple articles on autism understanding, diagnosis, and resources. See links, sites in the notes.
Hi, I'm Dr. Barry Prezant, clinical scholar, researcher, and consultant on autism and neurodiversity, and a Brooklyn boy raised in the big city.
And I'm Dave. I'm none of those things, and I grew up on a farm in Illinois. But being on the spectrum myself, I have plenty of personal insight to lend.
And this is Uniquely Human, the podcast, a show that illuminates and celebrates autism and neurodiversity. We have Zhara Astra on with us today on the podcast. Zhara is a screenwriter, producer, and an executive at Stone Village Television. She also is a professor at Arizona State University, where she teaches a course that she developed on understanding neurodivergent women, with an emphasis on autism in women and girls. In her work around this subject, she explores the lack of understanding as well as lack of proper diagnostics for women on the spectrum and the damage this is doing to females across the globe. She also is making a documentary series on the same subject. She states that, quote, "Getting my autism diagnosis completely changed the trajectory of my life, my work, and my life's mission. I have found my calling to change the way neurodivergent women are viewed, diagnosed, treated, as well as how women view themselves," close quote. Zhara is also a former competitive surfer and a mother to two little boys, one of whom is on the autism spectrum. Zhara, welcome to Uniquely Human, the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It is our pleasure. So maybe we could begin, not at the very beginning, but kind of the significant bits of your history that led you to your autism diagnosis, but also especially that led to one of the issues that you're very focused on now, and that is diagnosis and the importance of diagnosis in women on the spectrum.
Well, a couple years ago, someone suggested that my son may have been on the autism spectrum. So I started researching for him and took him in to get a diagnosis. And in the process, I read some things that sounded familiar to my own childhood experience. So I started diving into research on women on the spectrum, and I read a few books that were authored by actual autistic women. And I remember just crying at that moment reading this book because I finally felt understood. Like I'd been wandering around in this life for so long, feeling like an alien from another planet, but reading the stories of other women on the spectrum and their experiences was life-changing for me. So I eventually sought out a formal diagnosis, but I first went to a neuropsychologist to get a brain scan done because for me, I needed to see it to believe it. So I told the neuropsychologist I thought I was on the spectrum, and she told me she didn't think so because I didn't look autistic. I didn't seem autistic, yes. She scanned my brain anyway, and came back a week later telling me that she saw the gray matter or white matter or whatnot in my brain that was congruent with being on the spectrum. I then spent the next year trying to find a psychologist who could do an accurate assessment on a woman and who wouldn't charge me $5,000 to $8,000 to do it, which was the running rate around town here in Los Angeles. So I finally got my formal diagnosis, and it just completely changed the trajectory of my life, my work, my purpose, how I interact with my autistic child. Mm-hmm. It changed everything.
Isn't it funny? You can go your whole life thinking, I am who I am, definitely square peg in a round hole type of world, is you have a child and you can immediately see like, oh, that's how this person operates. Oh, they've got some real distinct differences from some of the other kids that they're growing up with. But it's funny, you can recognize it in your child. You don't recognize it in maybe yourself until you really look under the cover. And then it hits you like a ton of bricks. Like, oh, this answers so many questions I've ever had. It's a huge feeling of relief.
Absolutely. It is a feeling of, there's like the stages of grief that you go through when you get an adult diagnosis, where it's initially relief and then it's anger, because how did I get overlooked for so long? And why was I left out of the conversation? I went to psychologists. Where were they? So it's like this anger and this frustration. And then there's periods, I talk to a lot of women who go through periods of imposter syndrome, where I get my diagnosis and then I go back and I'm not actually autistic. That's not real. And then, you go into it and you're like, okay, then there's the whole acceptance, and then maybe back to imposter syndrome, and then back to acceptance. And then but now.
I can totally relate. And Barry, I know you've got so much to dive into, but I'll say this and then zip my lip. I can relate to the imposter syndrome thing. I don't know if you experienced that yourself, but I definitely, when I first got the diagnosis, it was actually my wife quasi-diagnosed me unofficially, because she was a speech therapist she was actually one of Barry's, she loved Barry's work, and that's why she went into speech therapy and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so she was working with autistic kids, spotted it with me about 5 years into our marriage. But when it was finally confirmed by like the healthcare professional, whatever, I felt like, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense. And then I started going to conferences, meeting a lot of different people with autism and how it shows up differently, and how, it presents itself differently in different people. And I started thinking, whoops, I don't know that I'm actually autistic, because I'm not facing the same challenges as these other people. Mm-hmm. So then I keep going back and even on this podcast for the last 18 months, I've been talking to Barry about like, yeah, sometimes I think like it's a lot of things that maybe kind of look like autism and aren't. And then I read Barry's book and I'm like, oh yeah, that's me. I'm autistic. Yeah. But I can totally relate to what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Zhara, I'm curious, when you say you felt like you landed on another planet, what were the kinds of things that you ran into, if not on a daily basis, frequently enough, that made you feel comfortable in kind of the neurotypical culture that we have here?
Oh, I don't know that I ever quite felt comfortable in the neurotypical culture, but I would just sit back as an observer. So as a writer and a storyteller, if I could just observe mankind as characters, right, in a book or in a script that I'm writing, then it would kind of help me. I don't know. It kind of seemed to help me out a little bit, I guess, with trying to understand them. But yep. It was certainly challenging, junior high school, just walking through the hallways, just feeling like I do not belong here. I don't know where I belong, but it doesn't feel like it's amongst these people.
Yeah. And I think so many teenage girls can relate to that, who are not part of a bigger conversation, like you said. I mean, the teen years are very hard for young women who are not the exact like center of the fairway mold of what society says a young teenage girl is.
Yeah. And if you think about that, I'm no expert in teenage girls, but kind of the cliquishness and kind of this social hierarchies that are formed, which is, at least in my experience as a non-autistic person, it's the type of thing that most friends I have and most people I know on the spectrum just say, I don't get that stuff. I don't get that kind of, deceit, backstabbing, or all of that kind of thing that really starts taking off like crazy in junior high school. My goodness.
That was just baffling to me. I could blend in with any crowd, though. I was friends with everybody. But I think, we'll get into masking later on in this episode and go into why that was possible.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So, what you experienced, certainly we've had some guests on here, Women on the Spectrum, is something that's not uncommon, but it made you like really want to get out there and say, what's going on here? It's really impacting people's lives in not a helpful way, not to accurately identify and understand the patterns in women. So it sounds like that was the fuel to light your fire.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it sounds like you saw that as an injustice, and that's not terrific. So, so what are some of the differences? I mean, a lot of people say that, wait a second, we're not identifying women early enough or accurately enough because the picture is different than it is for white males, which most diagnostic criteria are developed for. So what you faced in terms of what you discussed earlier about difficulties in getting a diagnosis, how is your story a lesson about the inadequacies in identifying and diagnosing autism in women?
Well, my experiences led me to see that still in this day and age, doctors, psychologists, neuropsychologists, they're still looking for these stereotypical, outwardly visible male representations of autism in order to even consider that someone is on the autism spectrum. That's why doctors still believe the autism ratio to be 4-to-1 male to females, right? And then when females do exhibit some of the same symptoms as males, they're likely to be diagnosed with something like anxiety or sleep disorders, neurotic, hysterical, bipolar, OCD, depression, anxiety, you name it. I was told before this that I had sleep deprivation and an anxiety disorder. And even at one point that I had a thyroid-related depression for a spell of time. I also grew up being told that I was just dramatic, right? Women are told that you're dramatic, you're hysterical, when in reality, I was hypersensitive to my environment, to smells, sounds, textures, to other people. But doctors and teachers and my parents, they weren't looking for those traits. And they certainly didn't suspect that I was autistic. I mean, I had a cousin with profound autism who was nonverbal. And that in the 90s is what we thought autism was. So I also discovered during my autism assessment that the questions used to determine autism weren't relevant to me. I remember going through dozens and dozens of pages of questionnaires, and the questions they asked me didn't feel relevant to my experience as a female with autism. One question that really didn't make sense was, would you rather go to the theater or the museum? And I couldn't comprehend why they were asking me this question, because I'd rather just stay home like most
Right. It was a trick question.
Yeah, exactly. And then in the diagnosis, there's the CARS observer form, which is often used in assessments. So family members fill out questionnaires about you, but they're only really able to discuss the observable traits that they can see, right? So I learned in this that my own family, they had no idea about the inner workings of my brain, the inner struggles that I had throughout my life. This was most apparent when I started talking about my OCD, which was so severe as a child that I felt like I was losing my mind. Like, I had rituals I had to do before everything, like knocking my knees together 3 times, 1 time, 3 times before getting in a car.
Was this taken seriously, the OCD piece, when you were little?
Oh, just wait. Okay, so everything I did involved numbers and counting and building pyramids by clicking my teeth together. Like the 3-1-3 pattern would create a pyramid because turning counting into a 3D shape made sense to me, right? So even though these OCD tendencies were debilitating and maddening for me as a child, no one in my family knew.
Yeah.
Man.
I was shocked in my 30s doing this CARS, observer form and seeing my parents' answers that they had no idea. Yet we're using these forms during the autism assessment as if that means anything at all, which it really doesn't. The observable traits, that they'll never get me or most women a proper diagnosis.
You know, I just want to share.
To be the most. Go ahead, Barry. Yeah.
I just want to share on a little bit of a light note here. We just had our parent retreat weekend last weekend and before last, and there was a mom who came from Portland, Oregon, and had been diagnosed just a few years ago as an adult, and she has a neurodivergent family with kids and husband, and she said that she had to come to the conclusion that the way she felt and experienced the world was autism, and it wasn't just New York. She grew up in New York City. It wasn't just New York City Jewish neuroses.
Yeah. The dismissiveness, when you're already feeling, to use Barry's great word, othered, when you're already feeling othered, teenage girl in a world that has ridiculous expectations for how girls behave, and boys' behavior can just be laughed off as boys will be boys, right? All that nonsense. Then the dismissiveness, feeling like you have to hide, that must have been, I mean, it must feel like the only time you felt like you were truly home was when you had your controlled Zhara world of, the knees, 1, 2, 3, the building the pyramids with, that makes perfect sense. And to not feel seen and heard and validated must have been, that must have been traumatic, especially at that age.
It was absolutely traumatic and exhausting and very, very difficult. And I think you nailed it with the controlled environment, because what we're seeing is a lot of autistic girls in school, they may appear to be shy and quiet. And then at home and their controlled environment, they can be very bossy and domineering. And we're going to play how I want to play. And if you don't want to, then you can leave. And that's exactly how I was.
But, that I think has led to your current mission. And you really focused on that in the Scientific American article. And I thought there was one quote that was absolutely profound. So this is right out of the article. You state that developing a more accurate diagnostic test is an issue of safety as well as quality of life. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Certainly. So autistic girls are 3 times more likely to be sexually abused than neurotypical girls. Girls with ADHD are twice as more likely to be sexually abused. So autistic girls with ADHD are more likely to be sexually abused and taken advantage of than most people. The statistics are just staggering. And here's why this is happening. Autistic females tend to be very straightforward and honest, and we expect others to be the same. So as you said earlier, not understanding the mind games of, and the deceit, we can't comprehend that. It doesn't, it's not natural. We also struggle to understand social norms and what is okay or inappropriate. We can also be naive when it comes to the ill intentions of others and can end up in dangerous situations. And non-speaking autistics are even at a higher risk of abuse because they aren't able to vocalize their abuse or stand up for themselves. So if we could diagnose girls at a younger age, we could prepare them for dangerous situations, and the same for adult women. Understanding this about ourselves might help us recognize when we're being taken advantage of. And I'll tell you, I didn't realize how much I personally had been taken advantage of until the Me Too movement. It was really difficult to sit back and read these stories, these other women, and think like that was inappropriate. That was wrong. I should have said something. And there's so many autistic women with the same stories.
And Zhara, you are young enough, but still of the age where that Me Too movement, you had so many life experiences prior to that, where all that, pardon the language, all that that men were doing and still are doing, as I'm saying the sentence, was normalized. And there was kind of a just quietness about it. And the danger and the quality, the safety and quality of life issue to me really sounds like even when a young woman on the spectrum would have the courage and the support around her to say, hey, this happened to me last weekend and I don't know what to make of it. Hopefully now it's more likely that they will be taken seriously, that this will be looked into, that they will be given the support that they need, instead of just, again, like I said, boys will be boys and you're not really autistic and like you don't have a say in this, Missy. That sort of mentality is only just very recently starting to shift.
Absolutely.
And I would imagine that with that awareness, on top of the social confusion you may find in some situations, that awareness that, oh my goodness, I really could be taken care of, might lead to kind of approaches or strategies that are kind of survival skills. And so now there's a lot of talk about masking, and especially masking in autistic women. So why do you feel that's come up as a critical issue, and especially regarding women, and only in very recent years?
Well, I always say that women don't have the luxury of having a disorder because of the high demands and expectations placed upon us from such a young age. Be a mom, have a career, have friends, have a social life, be a good wife, put everyone before you. It's a lot to juggle. And how in the world can we possibly do all those things and still honor our own needs? It feels impossible. And from a young age, we're taught to be quiet and sweet and polite. And I'm from the South. So, for me to take eye contact, don't draw too much attention to yourself, don't be too weird or too this or too that. So we start masking before we even know ourselves. And then we continue that throughout our lives. And now we're at an important work function and we're having to stuff our feelings and our sensitivities. And, meanwhile, the boss's cologne is setting you off in the crowd of people around you and the exhaustion of conversation after conversation and fake smiling. And we're doing it all in heels for many women. And it's a lot. But we feel like we don't have a choice. So we put on a mask and we blend in and we put our needs on the back burner. And then we just burn out entirely from time to time.
This material in an excerpt from a longer podcast or video. Follow link in description to learn more.